In Dustvale Ridge, there's a story they don't tell after sundown, about a veiled widow who made 3 men vanish, about a drunken bet that sparked a storm of blood and justice, and about one man, a former gun for hire, who dared to choose truth over silence, knowing it might cost him everything. Today, I'll tell you a story this town tried to bury, a bet that started as a joke and ended with a bullet, a secret, and a love no one saw coming. If this story stirred something in you, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next tale from the wild, untamed West, where every scar has a story and truth never sleeps quietly. I'm Wild West Drama, and I'll see you on the next ride down memory's dusty trail. The chandelier above the ballroom flickered with candlelight, painting long shadows across polished oak floors. The Silver Spur Hotel had never looked so polished, nor its guests so well-fed and well-liquored. Tonight was a gathering of the elite miners who struck lucky vines, ranchers fattened by cattle and coin, and politicians with hands greased by both. Caleb Rourke stood just outside the ballroom doors, hat in hand, boots dusty from the long ride in. He wasn't one for velvet drapes or champagne, but Gideon Black had personally asked him to come. A matter of land and leverage, the editor had said. That was enough to get Caleb to dust off his coat and head into enemy territory, high society. Inside, laughter echoed in corners thick with cigar smoke. A string quartet played off-key in the back. Caleb made his way to the bar, nodding once at Gideon, who stood leaning against a column, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Never thought I'd see you here," Caleb, Gideon said, offering a glass of bourbon. "Still, don't know if I believe it." "I'm here for water rights," Caleb said flatly. "Not the music." "And maybe a little show," Gideon murmured, eyes shifting toward the far end of the ballroom. There, standing like a portrait framed by velvet curtains, was the widow Maggie Wynn, black from neck to toe, including the lace veil that never left her face. She stood alone as she always did, but there was something magnetic about her presence. She didn't fidget. She didn't force small talk. She didn't smile. "She's been the subject of more rumors than silver strikes," Gideon added, "but no one's seen her face, not even the judge who filed her deed." Before Caleb could reply, a voice rang out from the nearby poker table. Sheriff Ronan Cross, half a bottle in, leaned back in his chair with the kind of grin that made men nervous. "I'll tell you what, gentlemen," Cross announced, raising his glass. "I'll grant full water rights back to Rourke's West pasture if he can get the widow Wynn to remove that veil before sunrise." A wave of laughter spread like wildfire. Glasses clinked. Chairs scraped. Gideon tensed beside Caleb. "You don't have to." But Cross wasn't done. "Come on, Caleb. You were a legend once. Heard you charmed a whole town into laying down their rifles during the war. Can't handle one woman." The crowd leaned in. Their amusement thickened the air. Caleb's jaw tightened. He hated being baited, especially by men who used power like a blade. "You offering the deed in writing?" Caleb asked, voice low. Cross chuckled. "Signed and sealed, sheriff's honor. If the veil falls before the rooster crows, the land is yours again." Gideon muttered, "Don't play his game. That land ain't worth your dignity." But before Caleb could speak, a ripple ran through the room. The widow was moving. She glided toward them, silent as snowfall, her heels echoing against the hardwood. The music died. Conversations froze. All eyes followed her, breath held. She stopped beside Caleb Vale, shimmering in the candlelight. When she spoke, her voice carried a lilting southern drawl, velvety, but with steel underneath. "I accept." Even Cross blinked, surprised. "What's that?" "I accept the wager," Maggie repeated. "If Mr. Rourke can last the night in my company until sunrise, I shall consider it." The room gasped. Cross tried to speak, but Maggie turned to Caleb and added, "One condition." He spends the night under my roof, not this circus. Let's see how much charm survives the silence. Caleb looked into the darkness beneath her veil and saw nothing, and yet he couldn't look away. Agreed, he said finally. Cross raised his glass again. Well, I'll be damned. But the storm was already brewing. As Maggie turned and walked toward the door, Caleb followed, every step echoing louder than the last. Outside, the wind howled low over the plains, and behind them, Dustvale Ridge held its breath, for the night had only just begun. The hoofprints in the dust seemed to vanish as the night swallowed Caleb's wagon beneath a ski smeared with stars. Maggie's estate rose ahead, an austere mansion of pale stone and dark timber, perched on a rise that surveyed the dry expanse of Dustvale Ridge. Caleb's skin prickled beneath the wide-eyed darkness, the whisper of wind carrying secrets from the desolate horizon. No words passed between them during the ride out. Maggie sat composed, gloved hands clasped until the light of lamp oil flickered within the mansion's foyer. Her silence weighed against the creak of wagon wheels, as though she existed in a domain beyond his understanding. When the door opened, she stood framed in lamplight, her figure draped in austere black, her posture unmoving. No greeting, no invitation, only a slight tilt of the head as if to say, "Enter." The foyer smelled of dust and lavender. Marble floors gleamed beneath layers of neglect. Caleb stepped inside, hat in hand, unsettled by the stillness. He could hear his own heartbeat clinging in the silence. Maggie closed the door with quiet deliberation, locks engaging with finality. The house seemed to exhale hail. She led him into a parlor that felt more tomb than living room. Chairs upholstered in faded velvet were arranged as though awaiting visitors who'd never return. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys coated with dust, its body mic and silent. Heavy curtains swallowed light, and odd intervals of glass, framed with tarnished gold, caught flickers of the lamps. A servant had vanished into the shadows without a sound. Maggie moved to a small table, where a kettle huffed quietly on a burner. She poured tea with deliberate precision, her gloved fingers steady, rhythmic. She placed a cup before Caleb, then one before herself, folding her hands as though the vessel were armor. Caleb dared to breathe. "Tea before gunfire, I prefer," she said, her voice smooth and yet chilling. He leaned forward, cradling the porcelain between calloused fingers. The steam curled upward, carrying hints of chamomile and bitterness. "Not much hospitality in a wager wrapped in a veil," he said. She lifted her cup and looked at him. "Hospitality is a luxury in Dustvale Ridge. I offer you company." He paused. "Company under these terms feels more like captivity." She tipped her cup. "Captivity can be a choice." Caleb studied her. The mask concealed her face, but her stance betrayed that she assessed him carefully. "I'm not charmed, Maggie." She shook her head. "You were charmed enough to ride all the way out here." Silence reclaimed the room. The kettle hissed. Dust motes shimmered in lamplight. He glanced at the piano. "Does that ever play?" "Not since the Promises died," she replied softly. "Music brings ghosts." Caleb blinked, the words dragging him into the past. "Music can soothe too." "It's never soothed mine," she said, voice like dusk. They sat tasting the tea and listening to the quiet, the house alive with unspoken histories. Caleb let his eyes drift toward the walls, portraits of ancestors in spots dark with age. A grandfather clock sat silent, its hands frozen on a midnight hour. "Why me?" he asked finally. Maggie tilted her head, veil undisturbed. "Because you looked inside the room instead of just noticing the tape and nails." Caleb frowned. "That's cryptic." Her reply made him lean forward again. "You're a man who carries death in your mind. You look like someone I trusted." His heart pounded. He felt heavier as her words settled. "Trust is expensive." "And I'm broke," she said. The wind outside rattled shutters. Caleb's skin prickled. He rose drawn upward by the sound of wood creaking soft, inevitable, like an argument from the past seeking attention. Expecting company, he asked, moving for the stairs. No, Maggie said, rising too. She stood beside him in the foyer. But some doors opened themselves. Caleb climbed to each step, creaking in protest. Upstairs was a hallway, dimly lit by a single sconce. Oil dripped down glass, casting shadows across closed doors. The floorboards were worn, and the stench of mothballs lingered. A door at the far end stood ajar. Warm light leaked beneath it. The air smelled stale and faintly of perfume. Caleb's fingers touched the knob. It was cold and locked. He frowned and tested force. Firm. He turned back only to find Maggie behind him, ghost-like. Some ghosts don't like company, she said, echoing downstairs. He swallowed. You locked it. She nodded glacially. Things stay behind some doors. Her gaze held his for a tense moment. Caleb swallowed a dark suspicion, but she offered no answer, only a nod that pulled him back. He descended. The parlor's silence was colder now, more empty. The fire from earlier had burned low embers, dull and red like ancient eyes. He drifted across the room, and at a side table, his fingers snagged something concealed beneath sheet music. A photograph. He pulled it free. The edges were cracked and curling. It showed Maggie's husband, handsome and speakling. Maggie standing beside him, cheek against his shoulder, unveiled, radiant. And behind them, unmistakable, Sheriff Ronan, crossarm around them both. Caleb's breath caught. The implications crashed through him, crossed the same man who mocked him earlier, intimately connected to Maggie. His hand closed around the photograph. Maggie appeared in the doorway, silhouette dark, but not menacing. You saw it, she said quietly. Caleb nodded slowly. She smoothed the edges of her gloves. Now the truth to be battled begins. The wind rattled the window panes. Above, the locked door groaned in darkness. And in that hush, Caleb knew the night had sealed itself not with agreements, but with revelations. Sleep didn't come easily for Caleb that night. The creak of the old house, the silent weight of Maggie's presence down the hall, and the photograph burned into his memory, all conspired to keep him awake. He stared at the ceiling above the guest bed, replaying the image again and again. 3 people. One of them a ghost now, one hiding behind a veil, and the last holding the badge of law, with bloodied hands. By dawn, he couldn't stand the silence any longer. He saddled his horse and rode back into town. Dustvale Ridge was still yawning awake, windows shuttered, smoke rising from early stoves, the metallic clink of miners' boots hitting dirt. But one place always stirred early: the Gazette. Gideon Black looked up from his desk, pipe smoke curling around his head like a halo of ink. You look like a man who's seen Judgment Day and wasn't on the good side, he said. Caleb didn't answer. He pulled the photograph from his coat and dropped it onto the table. Gideon leaned forward. His eyes tightened. You didn't know? Caleb asked, voice gravelly. Oh, I knew, Gideon said. I just didn't know you were ready to. Caleb's knuckles whitened. Cross officiated their wedding. Gideon nodded slowly. 3 years ago. Sterling, Wynn, and Margaret. Back then she was the pride of the Southern Valley. He was a landowner, generous with wages, always paid his taxes. Too generous. Too visible. And Cross wanted the Wynn estate for himself. He spun rumors, accused Sterling of aiding rebels harboring guns. All lies. One night he sent in his deputies, half were hired guns, the rest drunk on power. By morning, Sterling was dead, shot while resisting arrest. No trial, no questions. Maggie vanished. Caleb clenched his fists. She's not just grieving, Gideon continued. She's hunting. Caleb leaned against the desk, head down. Why involve me? Gideon looked at him sharply. Because Cross trusts you. Or rather, he underestimates you. Back at the estate, Maggie was in the garden, wearing black gloves, watering a vine that refused to grow in the desert soil. Her every motion was precise, almost ritualistic. Caleb approached slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots announcing him. "You knew I'd find that photo," he said. She didn't look up. "I left it for you." "Why?" "Because you deserved the truth before you stepped deeper. Before I stepped into what exactly?" She turned now, eyes calm beneath the veil. "A war that already began. One no one else is brave or foolish enough to finish." He stared at her, wind brushing between them, like a silent jury. "You've planned this," he said. "I've survived for this," she corrected. "Every stitch of mourning cloth I wear, every polite smile in town, every silent hour I spent pretending to be broken, all of it was armor." Caleb paused. "You could have told me. You would have walked away. I might have stayed. But I couldn't risk you making that choice out of guilt or curiosity." He sighed, taking off his hat, letting the wind run through his hair. "Then why me, Maggie?" Finally, she approached him, not threatening, not imploring, just human. "Because Cross believes you're harmless. Because he trusts your silence. Because deep down, he knows you'll never bow to him." "That doesn't answer my question." She tilted her head. "You're the only one in this town who doesn't want anything from me. That makes you the only man who might actually stand for something." He blinked at that. Inside, over coffee, she unfolded more of the plan. Gideon was helping quietly, feeding the paper with carefully timed stories to stir suspicion around Cross's past. Hollis, Caleb's younger brother, had been recruited too. Idealistic and angry, he had started digging through property records, whispering to townsfolk who had once benefited from the Wynn estate, and then been left with nothing. "Cross is smart," Maggie said, "but he's arrogant. The kind of man who thinks no woman, no widow, no outsider could ever outthink him." Caleb watched her carefully. "And what happens if your trap works?" Her voice lowered. "Then Cross hangs." Silence. Caleb leaned back. "This stopped being about your husband. It never stopped being about him," she snapped. "He was the best man I knew. And his name became ash, because no one dared speak against Cross." Her eyes shone through the veil. "But yes, it's about more now. It's about every family who lost land, every child who grew up fearing the badge, every man silenced by greed." Caleb felt the tremble in his chest before he could name it. Admiration, perhaps. Or a strange guilt he couldn't shake. She stepped forward. "I don't want you to fight for me, Caleb. I want you to fight beat me." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded once, slowly. That evening they sat together in the parlor. No piano, no tea, just quiet. Outside, wind kicked up dust like ghosts rising from the earth. He finally asked, "Do you miss him?" She didn't hesitate. "Every day. I'm not him. I know. But I'm here." She looked over. "I know that too." And for the first time, Maggie reached up and undid the top clasp of her veil. She didn't lift it fully, but even the act felt monumental. She let her voice soften. "I don't know what's coming. But when the trap springs, I want someone near me who won't run." "You've got me," Caleb said. For better or worse. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But the moment bound them tighter than flesh or fire. Outside, the shadows lengthened. Inside, the truth prepared its teeth. And somewhere across town, Ronan Cross poured himself a glass of bourbon, unaware that the ground beneath him had already started to shift. The morning sun was soft, filtering in through the dusty windows, like hesitant fingers brushing secrets from the air. Caleb found Maggie seated at the edge of the piano bench, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore her mourning black as always, but the veil. It lay folded neatly on the table beside her. It was the first time he had seen her without it. Her face was not marked by scars, no burns, no twisted flesh, nothing monstrous. Just the solemn, exquisite sadness of a woman who had carried too much grief too quietly for too long. Her eyes met his, and they didn't flinch. "You thought there would be something horrible," she said calmly, reading the question before he could ask it. "I didn't know what to expect," he admitted. "Well," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "sometimes sorrow is the only disfigurement people carry." Caleb sat across from her, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since the war. It wasn't fear, it was realization. Everything he thought he understood had shifted. "I need to tell you my real name," Maggie said, her hands trembling slightly. "It's Marguerite Leclerc." He blinked. "That's not Southern. French Louisiana. My father was a Judge Theodore Leclerc. Strict, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He arranged my marriage to Sterling Wynn when I was 23. I didn't love him at first, but I grew to admire him, even care for him. He was kind, which was more than I expected from any man in my father's circle." She stood and moved toward the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against something invisible. "But there were politics behind the marriage," she continued. "Sterling had land. My father had influence. Together they made powerful enemies, especially in Texas. She turned to Caleb, her eyes sharp now. Cross was one of them. He hated Sterling, resented the idea that a man of ideals could hold land he couldn't touch. He framed him, and when that didn't move fast enough, he had him killed. "And you?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "I ran. I couldn't trust anyone, not the courts, not the newspapers. My father died soon after in a carriage fire, but I suspect that too was no accident." Her jaw tightened. And then came the final blow. Cross filed federal charges against me, claimed I poisoned Sterling to claim his estate and flee. There's no proof, because there was never a crime. But in politics, a rumor is sometimes more lethal than a bullet. Caleb swallowed hard. "You were never hiding your face. You were hiding from the law." "No," she corrected him. "I was hiding from the injustice that wears the mask of law." He stood now, the weight of everything crashing down on him, like thunder over open plains. And now Cross found out. "I returned," she said. "I received a telegram last night. The federal marshal is arriving in 2 days." Caleb clenched his fists. "He'll try to drag you across state lines. He doesn't need to try. He has jurisdiction. You said this was about justice. It still is. You said this was a trap for Cross. It still is. But now it's you in the trap." She walked toward him, stopped just shy of touching. "I never asked you to save me," she said. "I'm not talking about saving you," he growled. "I'm talking about standing by you." Her expression broke for a moment, just long enough for a single tear to slide down her cheek. "Caleb, you could lose everything," she whispered. "I've lost things before," he said, "but I've never had a reason to fight like this." Outside, hooves thundered into the courtyard. They rushed to the window. A group of riders, federal deputies, men in gray coats, rifles slung across their backs, dismounted in unison. And in the center of them, atop a white gelding, was Sheriff Ronan Cross. He didn't wear a badge today. He wore a smile. Caleb turned to her. "If I ride with you now, there's no going back." Maggie reached for his hand. "You were never meant to go back, Caleb." Then she kissed him, not passionate but final, like sealing a promise written in dust and blood. A knock at the door. Heavy, rhythmic, certain. Caleb opened it. "Morning, Rourke," Cross said, tipping his hat, like they were old friends. "Marshal Claiborne," he added, nodding to the tall man behind him, "has business with a fugitive. Name of Marguerite Leclerc." "Never heard of her," Caleb replied flatly. Cross's smile twisted. "She's inside, harboring a fugitive's a federal crime. Is murder still a crime in this town? Caleb asked. Cross's eyes narrowed. You've made your choice then, the sheriff said coldly. Caleb stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I have. The two men stared at each other 20 paces apart, just like in the old days. But there would be no draw today, just consequences. The morning was unlike any other Dustvale had seen in years. Clouds hung low, thick with desert dust and tension. Word had spread like wildfire through the town. Caleb Rourke was calling for a public hearing at the town hall. Not a trial, not a gunfight, but something more dangerous. Truth spoken aloud. The hall was packed. Miners, ranchers, newspaper men, old war widows, and saloon girls all drawn in by the promise of reckoning. At the front stood Caleb, firm and unflinching, flanked by Maggie, unveiled and calm, and Gideon, black, with a satchel full of evidence in his hands. Hollis waited near the rear, his face pale but determined. Sheriff Ronan Cross entered, flanked by two deputies. He was clean-shaven, sharply dressed, and smiling, like nothing was wrong, like the air wasn't charged with suspicion and rage. Caleb stepped forward. This isn't a trial, he said, but it is a reckoning. For too long, Dustvale's been run by whispers, threats, and papers signed in the dark. Gideon opened his satchel and began reading aloud. Deeds, land seizures, testimonies from displaced families, even records from Louisiana connecting Cross to the false charges against Maggie. The audience murmured, their shock growing with every document. Forgery, Cross barked. Fabrications by a man who can't see past a pretty face. Maggie stepped forward, her voice steady. I was married to a man you murdered. Framed as a fugitive, hunted across 3 states. If Mr. Rourke is blind, then so is every soul who's lost something to your ambition. You want a show, is that it? Cross spat. You think justice comes with curtain calls and parchment? It comes with courage, Gideon said. Then from the back of the room, Hollis raised a set of sealed documents. These came directly from Judge Morales' circuit office. Legal proof. Maggie Wynn, Marguerite LeClaire, was never convicted. And that Cross, under a different name, used forged credentials to approve land deals under federal authority he didn't have. Gasps filled the room. Cross stepped back, hand hovering over his belt. This is slander. It's justice, Caleb said. Or you can draw and see who Dustvale stands with now. For a heartbeat silence. Then Deputy Hayes, the sheriff's own man, raised his revolver, pointed it at Cross. I've followed you too long, Hayes said, voice tight. Watched too many good folks lose everything. I won't be part of it no more. Cross turned incredulous. You'd betray me. You betrayed this town, Hayes snapped. Cross reached for his weapon. Too slow. Bang! Hayes fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Panic rippled, chairs scraping back, but nobody fled. Cross lunged. But it wasn't Hayes who stopped him. It was Maggie. One shot. Clean. Into the leg. Cross dropped with a howl. She walked forward, smoke curling from the barrel of the pistol once owned by her husband. For Sterling, she said. The rest, I'll leave to the law. The room was dead silent. Caleb stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She simply lowered the gun and nodded to Hayes, who cuffed the sheriff without ceremony. Outside, Dustvale felt different. Lighter. Like something rotten had finally been dug up and burned. Later that day, Caleb stood on the porch of the courthouse, staring out over the town. You made a choice, Gideon said, joining him. And now Dustvale has to make one too, Maggie, Caleb asked. She's at the ranch, packing. He nodded, unsure of what that meant. That night, as the wind howled softly through the canyons, Caleb returned home. The house was quiet, but warm. Maggie sat at the piano, fingers resting lightly on the keys. She didn't play, just listened to the silence. I suppose it's over, she said. No? he said gently. It's just beginning. She looked up at him, eyes tired, but no longer afraid. I have to leave. There are still people who want me buried. Cross was just the loudest among them. I know. I thought about asking you to come with me. Why didn't you? Because I won't be the reason you leave your land again. He stepped closer. I already left that land when I chose you. She smiled, sad and proud. You're a good man, Caleb Rourke. But I'm not the woman who stays. She kissed him soft and final. Then she left. 1 year later, New Orleans was rain-washed and warm that spring afternoon. Caleb Rourke stepped off the riverboat, dressed in gray, his boots still carrying the red dust of Texas airs. He wandered the old quarter until he found it. A small tea house, wooden porch, white ribbon tied around a post. He stood there for a long time. Then the door creaked open, and there she was, Marguerite Leclerc. No veil, no mourning dress, just eyes full of knowing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Some love stories don't need promise, no wedding rings, no grand vows. Just a look across a New Orleans street, after lies, blood, and silence, and the unspoken message, I'm still here, if you're still looking. Caleb Rourke was no perfect hero. He was a man forged by war, hardened by land, and quietly starving for something real. He didn't come to rescue a damsel. He met a woman who didn't need saving, only someone to truly see her. Marguerite Leclerc wasn't a victim. She didn't flee her past. She confronted it, peeled back every lie, and chose truth over safety. And maybe Dustvale Ridge never needed a fast gun. It just needed one man, willing to risk everything for what's right. Because the Wild West wasn't just about outlaws and cowboys. Sometimes it was a place where broken souls found their way back to each other through dust, fire, and truth.